Hi, everybody. So today I would like to talk about voter suppression, and I'd like to talk about it in the context of the race for governor in Georgia. Right now, the polls are showing Abrams, the Democrat, and Kemp, the Republican, neck and neck. So I just wanted to go over a couple of things that have been in the headlines recently pertaining to voter suppression in that state. So as I just mentioned, the polls are showing Abrams and Kemp neck and neck in this tight governor's race. But there's only one issue here. The man administering the elections happens to be Kemp. Brian Kemp is the Secretary of State in Georgia and also the Republican nominee for governor. And I find this kind of concerning because, I mean, wouldn't you find it a little bit weird if LeBron James or Tom Brady were refereeing games that they were playing in? That's essentially what's going on in Georgia right now. So, one of the main things that Kemp has come under fire for in this election and previous elections, he's actually been sued over it before, is something called exact match verification. So uh, there's 53,000 voter registrations on hold right now in this governor's race in Georgia, and the exact match verification means that information on the registration applications when people register to vote has to be an exact match, an absolutely exact match with information on file with driver services and the Social Security Administration. Something as small as a missed hyphen, the smallest typo at all, it can hold up an application to register to vote. And one of the things that I want to highlight, and the national media has been highlighting, is take this following statistic: the Georgia population, 32% is African American. Applications on hold out of those 53,000 right now, 70%. So there is a quite disproportionate impact on the African American community in this particular race. Now I'd like to jump over to a specific county that's been getting some media attention. In the October 15th Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the paper, of course, for the city of Atlanta, they highlighted Gwinnett County, a county that is northeast of the city of Atlanta. It has a large minority population, a sizable amount of Latinos in that population, and the headline read something close to, nearly 1 in 10 vote by mail ballots rejected in Gwinnett. And this is compared to less than 2% mail in ballots rejected statewide in Georgia. And so, again, there's this disproportionate impact on a minority community. And what was interesting is in that article, they said, if you're concerned about your mail-in ballot being rejected, guess who you have to contact? That's right, Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State who is running for governor and has been accused of trying to suppress people's votes before and has been sued over it. Really quickly, I'd like to talk about a Supreme Court case that set some pretty relevant precedent in terms of voting rights. 2013 Supreme Court, Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, as in Eric Holder, the Attorney General under President Obama. So this case set relevant precedent regarding the Voting Rights Act, which was signed in 1965 at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. The aim of the act, the aim of the legislation, was to overcome barriers at state and local levels that prevented Black people from voting. So pretty much when that act was signed, there was a formula that identified jurisdictions with history of prejudice and voter suppression, and those jurisdictions had to pass federal scrutiny whenever they wanted to change or enact new voting laws. And what this Supreme Court case did was it invalidated that formula. One of the results of the decision was that communities fighting new voting laws that that they argued were discriminatory, like the exact match voting law that's in question in Georgia right now, they had to file suit on their own or rely on outside advocates for help doing so, which is tough. Like, it's tough for people to organize and sue like an entire state, for instance. And it was really interesting because in the majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts cited outdated data for the formula that um, that decided which jurisdictions needed to pass this extra scrutiny before enacting new laws, which makes sense. But he also said that it wasn't necessary anymore because 2013 was totally different than the 60s, and there had not been discrimination nearly on the same scale, which is true. But but then we go to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent, which makes more sense. She pretty much argues that, yeah, there hasn't been as much voter suppression or issues at the polls for minorities because the Voting Rights Act was working. I mean, and she has this famous analogy. She says it's like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And I tend to agree with Justice Ginsburg. Back to Georgia, a couple of things, a couple more points I'd like to make. An October 18th article from Slate talks about dozens of older African Americans. They're traveling on a bus to go vote early, and they were kicked off the bus. And according to county officials, it was because they were participating in prohibited political activity. And it's just interesting because we as Americans should want as many people, as many legal citizens as possible to be voting. And I just thought it was kind of odd that the county officials would cover this up by saying prohibited political activity. And Georgia, let's just face it. I mean, there's parts of Georgia that I'm sure are very progressive, but I'm sure that it is one of those states that would have a lot of areas that would have been covered under that formula from the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These older black people, these older black voters are on their way to the polls and they get kicked off the bus. I mean, some of these people probably couldn't drive. That's why they were taking the bus to go vote. It just doesn't make any sense. So I wanted to cite that very quickly. All right, and then another article out of Slate on October 18th. Do you remember Exact Match from earlier in the video with all those registrations held up? This October 18th article talks about how the state of Georgia does not require even very simple handwriting analysis training for their election workers. And it's interesting because there had been previously a lawsuit in New Hampshire where I think it was a forensic person who analyzes handwriting for a living says that effective signature comparison requires 10 signature samples at least to account for variability. So you've got these two signatures that you're trying to match, and the state doesn't even require very simple handwriting analysis techniques to be taught to their election workers. Doesn't add up. And the disproportionate impact here is on those with disabilities, the elderly, and non-native English speakers. Because, I mean, simply their signatures are more likely to change over time. And in addition, if that wasn't bad enough, there's no requirement in the state to send rejection letters for people's voter registration being denied in a speedy, or I should say expeditious fashion in any way. So that leaves even less time to fix before the crucial day of Election Day. I'd like to just go ahead and wrap this up. There's a race in Georgia right now that, according to the pollsters, is just so very close. And it's an abuse of power for Mr. Kemp, the Secretary of State, to be administering his own election. He should have stepped down. The Abrams campaign has requested that he step down or recuse himself, at least temporarily, as Secretary of State, um, because he shouldn't be refereeing a game that he's playing in. These dirty tactics, these voter suppression tactics, this is just one of many. There's voter ID laws. There's gerrymandering, so people's votes count for less, and things like that. But this is just one of many of the tricks that primarily Republicans engage in across the country. And they try to make a point that, they want to stop voter fraud or illegal aliens from voting. But the data and the literature on that has found that it's almost non-existent. It is mostly something that is made up in order to create more stringent voter ID laws, stringent laws such as exact match. And in a race that's so close, over 53,000 registrations being on hold is a big deal. And it's especially a big deal when it appears that they're going after a core constituency of Democrats. Abrams is running to be, I believe, the first African American female governor. And these registrations and issues with the exact match are highly disproportionately affecting the African American community. Not to say that all black people would vote for Miss Abrams, but it's a core constituency for her party, and people do tend to vote for those that look like them. Not all the time, but they might be more likely to. And what happened with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is just a tragedy, because these historically prejudiced areas are able to make up these new laws and not have to undergo stricter federal scrutiny. And I can elaborate more on other videos, but as soon as that 2013 decision was rendered, a whole bunch of states in the South with very long histories of voter suppression and prejudice started to really hit the books with a lot of laws that many charge are aimed at suppressing minority votes. Um, and then just the unprecedented act of ordering dozens of older black voters off of a bus headed to vote early because of prohibited political activity. It just makes no sense. And then you get down to the fact that this whole exact match thing is complete BS, because they're not even teaching their election workers in Georgia how to compare signatures. And again, that disproportionately affects those with disabilities and non-native English speakers. So more minorities, more people that are disadvantaged and disenfranchised already. So at the end of the day, this is just one state that has been in the news for this. I've heard very strong stories with very strong evidence of issues in Indiana and Nevada and other states. So it's more widespread than just Georgia, I'd like to point out. But I just had to highlight it because it just seems so blatant, especially due to the fact that one of the people running for governor is administering the election. So please hit subscribe. I'd love for you guys to subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Twitter at JasonBPolitics, and I'll see you guys soon.